Mr. President, these past few weeks I've been coming to the floor to talk about the size and scope of our nation's fiscal problem. It's been said often that this is the most predictable crisis we've ever faced, and I believe that's true. I've talked about how the tremendous growth of government has limited the ability of small businesses to create jobs. I've noted that the severe and dramatic cuts that Medicare, Medicaid, and Social Security will face if we do not act now to reform those programs now. And I've also pointed out how these draconian cuts would need to be paired with painful, job-crushing tax hikes. Simultaneously, the interest that we pay on that debt will take up an ever-increasing share of our revenue. In fact, it's already been noted that in a few short years, the interest on the debt alone would exceed the amount that we spend on national security. In other words, we would spend more paying for the amount of money that we borrow in the form of interest than we spend defending the country. At some point, bondholders are going to recognize that we don't have an ability to pay out these bonds, and they will demand increasingly higher interest rates. This in turn sends our interest rates even higher, a vicious spiral. However, what I'd like to focus on today, Mr. President, is to talk about how none of this is necessary. So how do we prevent this from happening? I think the solutions that we need fall really into three broad categories. We need reforms to our budget processes that include, one, a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution. We need caps on overall and discretionary spending, and we need entitlement reform. In the 1990s, the Senate was within just one vote of passing a balanced budget amendment to the Constitution. And I can't help but think, Mr. President, just how different our country's fiscal situation would be if that amendment had been approved. We have two now different balanced budget amendment proposals put forward this year. I co-sponsored both of them. I had the opportunity to lead a working group of my fellow Republican senators to discuss these proposals and to help find the best parts of each. From those discussions and others, we were able to come together with the Hatch-Lee Balanced Budget Amendment, of which every single member of the Republican conference is a co-sponsor. This important amendment requires the budget to be balanced every year, except for when there is a declared war. A supermajority would be required to waive this provision. This amendment puts the emphasis on controlling spending, which is the real cause of our debt and deficits. It requires supermajorities to raise taxes, and it prevents spending from exceeding 18% of our GDP, 18% of our entire national output, which has been the historical level of taxation for our country. Not only do we need to balance our budget, Mr. President, but we need to ensure that every dollar is being spent in the most efficient way possible. We need to be honest about the cost of this spending and to create processes that will prevent wasteful, unnecessary, and excessive spending. In order to do this, we need a number of budget reforms in addition to the Balanced Budget Amendment. Now, I've introduced a Deficit Reduction and Budget Reform Act, and this has a number of reforms to the budget process that we use today. The bill reforms the pay-go rules to prevent the double-counting gimmicks that get used around here all too frequently, and it makes the federal budget a binding joint resolution signed into law by the President, something that doesn't happen today with our budget. It moves us into a biannual budget timeline, which leaves more time for oversight. As everybody knows, we do, or we're supposed to do at least, a budget every year. We haven't done one now here for 777 days, so the notion that we do a budget every year may be somewhat an antiquated one, but we are supposed to do a budget every single year. Because of that, we spend an awful lot of time going through the budget process, doing all the appropriation bills, and it doesn't allow very much time for oversight, which is a function that I think we have a responsibility to do. And so if you went to a biennial budget, in other words, if you did a budget every other year, if you did the spending, the budget and the appropriation bills in the odd-numbered years, in the even-numbered years when people have to go home to run for re-election, we could actually focus on oversight. We could look for ways not to spend money, but for ways to save money. I've been a big advocate of biannual budgeting, doing a budget every other year, two-year budgeting for some time. A number of states do it that way. And I think it's important that we make that reform so that we have the appropriate time to do the level of oversight that is required and is so, I think, desperately missing around here today, which is why we end up having, I think, so many government agencies with so much duplication, so much redundancy, and so much overlap that leads to wasteful spending on behalf of the American taxpayers. And so the other thing that it would do is my budget reforms, it would create a legislative line item veto. My governor in South Dakota has that, and I believe the president should too. In fact, I think most governors across this country have some sort of mechanism that allows them to veto extraneous spending measures. I believe the president ought to have that power, and needs to be done in a way, of course, that's consistent with the Constitution, and a legislative line item veto would meet that test. It prevents the abuse of emergency spending designations, which have been used to pass hundreds of billions of dollars in deficit spending since the last time we passed a budget resolution. And it creates a new Class Act trigger so that if that program is not solvent, or to make sure that that program is solvent over the 75-year time frame. Now, I think most of my colleagues know that the Class Act is a new long-term care entitlement program that was enacted as part of the health care reform bill last year. It, like so many other government programs, relies upon premiums that will be paid in the early years, which lead to actually show revenues coming into the Treasury, which are then counted and used to pay for other things, in this case, the health care bill. But at some point in the future, when the demands come for those benefits that people have subscribed for, it becomes a liability. And because the funds, the revenues that have come in to that program in the early years have already been spent, again, it leads to more and more borrowing. And that is what the Congressional Budget Office has said would happen with the Class Act. We need to make sure if that program is going to stay on the books, and by the way, I have a piece of legislation that would repeal it because I think it's really bad policy, and I think it's going to put our country in an even deeper fiscal hole. But that being said, if it's going to stay on the books, it ought to have a mechanism whereby we ensure that that program is solvent over the 75-year time frame, and so my legislation would do that. Likewise, it modifies the Medicare cost containment trigger to have honest accounting with respect to revenues and savings in the new health care bill. And it updates the Credit Reform Act to score the purchases of debt, stock, equity, and capital using a discount rate that incorporates market risk. Whenever the government gets in the business of acquiring debt, stock, equity, those sorts of things, and that hasn't happened, as we know, in the last few years, it needs to be accounted for honestly by using real discount rates that make market risk a part of that calculation. And today, that isn't necessarily the case when those calculations are made. It also creates a new Standing Joint Committee of Congress for Budget Deficit Reduction. Now, it might interest my colleagues to know that sometimes we forget about this around here, but we have 26 committees in Congress and subcommittees that spend tax dollars. We don't have one that focuses on saving tax dollars. We need a committee that is exclusively committed to reducing the cost of spending, to saving tax dollars as opposed to spending them. 26 committees and subcommittees around here that spend money. It's time that we had one that saved money. So the Joint Committee would be responsible for producing a bill to cut the deficit by at least 10% every budget cycle, and to do it without raising taxes. It would be a standing committee that would continue to fight government spending and would even issue recommendations to cut spending by at least 1% even in years when the budget is balanced. Now, it's been a long time since we've seen that around here. That probably isn't going to happen in the foreseeable future. I certainly hope that it does. But in any case, my legislation would require, even in years when the budget is balanced, that we be looking for ways to cut spending. Importantly, these recommendations would be assured of an up and down vote in Congress. So this committee would make its recommendation each year, and my legislation would require expedited consideration on the Senate floor. In other words, to ensure that it gets an up and down vote and that it doesn't get languished somewhere like so many reports that come out of various committees. This committee would actually have the authority to put a product out on the floor of the Senate and to ensure that it gets a vote. Finally, what my bill would do, Mr. President, is freeze and cap spending, the third action we need to take in order to get spending under control. This bill would institute a 10-year spending freeze at 2008 levels adjusted for inflation. After all, between 2008 and 2010, non-defense discretionary spending increased by 24%, while inflation in the overall economy was just over 2%. So the federal government in the last couple of years, between 2008 and 2010, was spending at literally over 10 times the rate of inflation. Now, how can you go to the American taxpayer with a straight face and explain that? So we need to go back to those 2008 levels and freeze it there, cap it in there, and then allow for adjustments for inflation. But let's go back and negate this 24% increase that we've seen just in the last couple of years. Now, the recent continuing resolution that was passed by Congress started to put downward pressure on these accounts, but more needs to be done. My colleagues, Senators Corker and McCaskill, have introduced what they call the CAP Act, which would put our spending on a downward glide path so that we don't spend more than our historical average of 20.6% of GDP. For the last 40 years, Mr. President, we have averaged, spending on the federal government has averaged 20.6% of our total economy. So that represents all of federal spending. That doesn't represent state and local government spending, but federal spending, percentage-wise on average for the past 40 years, has equaled 20.6% of our entire economic output. Well, this year, we are in the 24 to 25% range. So now we have gone from spending a fifth of our entire economy on the federal government to spending about a fourth of our entire government, or our entire economy on the government. That, to me, is something that needs to be reined in. We've been a huge ramp up in spending as a percentage of our entire economy. What that means is that the private economy as a percentage of our whole economy is getting smaller, and the government spending, the government component of that, is getting larger. And we need to get that back on a more historical and what should be a realistic course. So there are at least three different possible proposals to cap spending. The 18% included in the constitutional amendment, the CAP Act, which I just mentioned, and my own proposal to cap discretionary spending. These caps are necessary to signal to the markets that we are serious about cutting spending. Finally, Mr. President, we need entitlement reform. The CAP Act and the 18% cap would both force us to deal with entitlements. Now, I am heartened by the budget working group that's being led by Vice President Biden, that they are considering some entitlement reforms. And I hope that they can produce a product that actually will tackle entitlements. And we really need to have, at the end of the day, the President leading on this. This group that's been put together, I hope will, as I said, produce a result that will take us down a path toward tackling runaway entitlement programs. But we've got to have, at the end of the day, and for any of this to be accomplished, for any of this to get signed or get enacted, we have to have the President stepping in and providing leadership. And so far, Mr. President, we have not seen that. The President, in his budget that he submitted to Congress and a subsequent budget speech that he made, has done little, if anything, to deal with the issue of entitlement reform. And frankly, you cannot deal with the fiscal problems that this country faces, the challenge that we face, or the deep hole that we're in when it comes to getting on a more sustainable course for the future without taking on entitlement reform. The President needs to be explaining to Americans the need for entitlement reform and showing us what his plan is to save Social Security, Medicare, and Medicaid, not simply getting out and demagoguing Chairman Ryan's budget and kicking the can further down the road. We know that these entitlements already represent $61.6 trillion in unfunded liabilities. There is no more road. We have kicked the can as far as we can. It is now time for us to face the reality that we have to deal with this, and we can't afford the luxury of waiting any longer. It is clear that action needs to be taken. And if the President were to step up to the plate, I think we'd have a real chance to enact substantial entitlement reforms that could preserve the important role that these programs play. So enacting these three different prongs, or these three different approaches, Mr. President, one dealing with budget reforms that include a balanced budget amendment being the first component, spending caps being the second component on both discretionary and overall spending, and entitlement reform, those are not going to be easy things to do. And we've been on autopilot around here for a long time, and what that has gotten us is deeper and deeper into a fiscal hole, to the point that today we are at $14 trillion in debt, meaning that we're going to have to raise the debt limit here in the very near future, and growing by the day. And the amount that it grows by the day, interestingly enough, is $4 billion. we will borrow between this time and 10/40 tomorrow another $4 billion that we will add to our children's debt. Now, that represents more than we spend in my home state of South Dakota for an entire year. $4 billion, the amount that we borrow every single day at the federal level, exceeds the amount that the state of South Dakota spends in an entire year. That is the dimension of the problem that we were dealing with. Now, I think I always say there are three really important numbers that I think people need to focus on to just remind ourselves how critical it is that we act. One is 42. That's the cents out of every dollar that we borrow. That 42 cents out of every dollar that this government borrows today, or this government spends today, is borrowed. That is a staggering statistic. The other number is 93. 93 is the number now that represents the percentage of our entire economic output that is represented by our gross debt. In other words, our debt to GDP, our debt to total economic output ratio is 93%. That's the danger zone. Historical research has shown and demonstrated that when you get a debt to GDP ratio that exceeds 90%, that you are losing 1 percentage point of economic growth every single year. And 1 percentage point of economic growth translates into 1 million lost jobs. So every year that we continue on this path of sustaining this level of debt as a percentage of our entire economic output, we are bleeding 1 million jobs in our economy. It's costing us 1 percentage point of economic growth. That is a very real and immediate impact from the amount of spending and the amount of debt that we have. And the final number that I think is important for people to understand too, and that's the number I mentioned earlier, Mr. President, and that is the 777 number, because that's the number of days it's been since Congress has passed a budget. Now, I know that it's very hard around here, particularly in circumstances like we're in, to find consensus on a path forward when it comes to a budget. But we have a responsibility to the American taxpayers when we are spending literally $3.7 to $3.8 trillion every single year to at least let them know how we're going to spend their money. We haven't done a budget here in 777 days. Now, I've served on the Budget Committee. We have not had a markup. There is no indication that we will have a markup. There's no indication that we're going to do a budget. We've already blown past all the deadlines that the law requires when it comes to doing a budget. We didn't do a budget in the last Congress, and I think what that does is it makes it even more complicated to address these issues. Because if you don't have an overall framework, if you don't have a construct or an understanding of what it's going to take to get our books back in order, then it's going to be really, really difficult. You know, sometimes around here we don't have enough teeth in the laws that we have when it comes to budgeting. We don't have enough enforcement mechanisms, which are things that the budget reforms I'm proposing would try to cure. But even with that, I mean, you at least have to have a plan. You at least have to have a blueprint, a path for how you are going to spend $3.7 trillion of the American taxpayers' money. And so I would urge my colleagues, the majority, to put forward a budget. At least let's debate it. Let's talk about priorities. Let's have a debate. Let's debate amendments. But let's either do a budget or let's reform the budget process along the lines of what I've suggested so that we get a process in place that enables us to make some headway, to make some progress toward dealing with this runaway debt, these runaway deficits that are just going to not only crush our economy in the near term, but put an unfair burden on future generations of Americans. Right now, the thing that most Americans are worried about, spending, debt, jobs, the economy, and they're all connected. The level of spending and debt is something that needs to be gotten under control to get the economy growing and prospering again, so you don't have the federal government out there competing with the private economy when it comes to capital. Small businesses need capital to invest, to create jobs. When the government is crowding that out, it makes it more difficult. There are so many adverse implications, economic implications, from the debt levels that we are sustaining today. It is going to make it increasingly difficult the longer we stay deeper and deeper in the red for this economy to recover and grow. So that's fundamental to all this. When it comes to jobs and the economy, we also have to have policies that encourage economic growth. And I know that the President has, talks a lot about jobs and the economy. He certainly is, rhetorically, I think, at least saying the right things out there. But you've got to have actions that are consistent with the rhetoric. And if you look at the record, the President's record, we haven't seen that. The reason we haven't seen that is because the policies are all adverse to economic growth and job creation, whether it's regulations coming out of agencies, whether it's the new mandates imposed by the health care reform bill, whether it's the out-of-control spending and debt and no attempt to address the long-term challenges that we face there, particularly entitlement reform, whether it's the new taxes that have been imposed through the legislation that's been enacted since this President's come into office. But if you look at the economic record, you look at unemployed Americans since this President took office, we have almost 2 million more unemployed Americans. Unemployment rate has gone up 17%. Fuel prices, which impact everybody's pocketbook in this country, since this President has took office, have gone up by over 100%. Over 100% increase in the price per gallon of gasoline since this President took office. The federal debt has gone up 35%. The debt per person in this country has gone up $11,000 per person. That's the amount that the debt has increased since this President took office. Food stamp recipients are up 39%. Health insurance premiums, despite all the promises about what health care reform would do to lower insurance premiums, health insurance premiums have gone up 19%. Since this President took office. Now, the only thing that has gone down, Mr. President, since he took office is home values. Home values are down 12%. So that is the economic record. That's the composite record. And of course, we can all say things, but we have to be judged by what we do. You can't judge people by what they say. You have to judge them by what they do. And I hope that the President will decide that it is time for him and for his administration and for his leadership here to focus on policies that will be conducive to economic growth, that will enable that, rather than make it more expensive and more difficult to create jobs, which is what the policies that are being employed by this administration are doing today. And as I said, that applies to so many areas. It's developing domestic energy resources so that we can get more American supply of energy and start driving that price down. So many areas are off limits. Even more have gone off limits since this President took office. It means getting trade bills enacted. We've heard now for several years the President talk about we need to pass the Colombia, Panama, and South Korea free trade agreements, and yet they languish. They haven't been submitted to us. We're ready to act. We have said repeatedly these are important to our economy. And I've used this example on the floor before, but just one brief data point for agriculture. I represent an agricultural state, and so we're always looking for opportunities to export. In wheat, corn, and soybean exports, we had an 81% share of the Colombia market in wheat, corn, and soybeans in 2008. In 2010, that had dropped to 27%. We have literally been locked out of that market because this free trade agreement has languished here in Congress, and as a consequence, other countries have stepped in to fill the void. And so now you have the Canadians, the Europeans, the Australians stepping in and picking up the slack, and we continue to lose and erode more and more market share, which means more and more lost jobs in the American economy. So it's about trade policies, tax policies, energy policies, regulatory policies, and spending and debt. Those are the things, Mr. President, that in my view will get this economy back on track, start creating jobs, create a better and brighter and more prosperous future for future generations of Americans. Unfortunately, the policies being employed by this administration are making it worse, and at least according to this economic record, much, much worse. We can do better. We should do better by the American people, and I hope that we will find the political will here to do that. Mr. President, I yield the floor.